Colorado Territory, autumn of 1874. The freight wagon groaned under its own weight as it rolled down the narrow trail, flanked by golden aspens and the smell of cold pine. On the bench seat, bundled in a too-thin wool shawl and clutching a creased letter, Adeline Lancaster blinked against the wind and tried not to cry. She had ridden trains, stagecoaches, and now this wagon across half the country to marry a man she had never met. Except now the driver was scratching his chin, glancing at the letter she held like it might solve the problem. "Ma'am, this place here's Birch Valley, but this name—" He tapped the envelope. "Says Buckhorn Ridge. That's a day's ride east." "You sure this is the right spot?" Adeline looked at the name again, Mr. Thomas Granger, Buckhorn Ridge. Her heart sank. "I thought this was it. The postmaster back in Denver said this was the only Birch-sounding town for miles." The driver sighed, climbed down, and helped her with her trunk anyway. "Sorry, miss. I got a delivery to make. Fellow over yonder might let you rest the night. He keeps to himself. Name's Boone Destry." Adeline's worn boots hit the dirt. "Boone Destry." The driver pointed toward a small ranch tucked behind a line of pine trees. Smoke curled from the chimney and horses paced in a fenced pasture. "He lost his wife 3 winters back. Good man. Quiet." The wagon rolled away, leaving Adeline standing with her trunk and her stitched-up dreams. She squared her shoulders and started toward the cabin. She had not come all this way to give up now. Boone Destry had just finished splitting the last log when he heard the knock. He wiped his hands on his trousers and opened the door to find a young woman with wind-blown curls and eyes too tired for her age. "Evening," she said, voice tight with nerves. "My name is Adeline Lancaster. I think I was sent to the wrong place." Boone blinked. "Come in, Miss Lancaster." He stepped aside, letting her enter the warmth of the fire-lit cabin. The inside smelled like cedar and tobacco. A rifle hung above the hearth, and 2 mugs sat drying by the basin. "I was meant to meet a man named Thomas Granger in Buckhorn Ridge," she said. "I came as a mail-order bride. I thought this was the town." Boone rubbed his jaw. "You are about 100 miles west of where you meant to be." Her face fell. "But," he added, "you do not have to ride tonight. Sit. Warm up." She nodded, lowering herself onto a wooden chair near the fire. "Thank you." He poured her coffee and handed her a tin cup. "You came all the way from where?" "Missouri," she said, wrapping her fingers around the cup. "My sister married and moved east. There is nothing left for me back there." Boone leaned against the wall. "I understand that." She glanced up at him. "You live here alone. Used to be 4 of us. My wife, my parents, all gone now, just me and the land." Adeline looked around the modest cabin, neat, quiet, filled with the kind of silence that only follows grief. "I am sorry." Boone nodded. "Me too." Night fell heavy and Adeline stayed. Boone gave her his bed and took the floor by the fire. She tried to insist, but he would not hear of her sleeping anywhere else. "In the dark," she asked. "Do you think he will still want me?" "Thomas Granger." Boone stared at the ceiling. "You are a kind woman and brave." "Any man would be lucky." She did not answer, but the quiet stretched softer between them. By morning, snow dusted the ground. Boone hitched his horse to the wagon. "I will take you to Buckhorn Ridge. It is not right for you to go alone." Adeline stood on the porch, her shawl pulled tight. "You do not have to do that." "I want to." She hesitated. "Why?" Boone looked at her, something unspoken in his eyes. "Because I have been waiting a long time for someone to knock on my door." Adeline's breath caught, but she said nothing. Instead, she climbed into the wagon. They rode in silence for an hour, the trail winding through pine shadows and rising snow. At a narrow bend by a frozen creek, a sharp yelp split the air. Boone reined the horse to a stop. "Did you hear that?" Adeline nodded, already climbing down. They followed the sound over a small ridge. There, tangled in brush, was a little girl no more than 4 or 5, her dress torn, her cheeks streaked with tears and dirt. Adeline dropped to her knees. "Sweetheart, it is all right. We are here." The girl flinched but did not run. Boone crouched beside them. "Where did you come from?" The girl pointed back toward the woods. "Mama left. She said she was coming back. She never came." Adeline's heart twisted. "What is your name, Amira?" Boone lifted her gently. "We will take care of you." They rode back toward Boone's cabin. It was clear the girl had been alone for days. Boone built up the fire and cooked eggs while Adeline wrapped Amira in dry blankets. The child curled against her, fast asleep. Boone watched her from across the room. "That is not a child you leave behind by accident." "No," Adeline whispered. "That is a child who was abandoned." Boone nodded slowly. "She can stay here with me for as long as she needs." Adeline looked at him. "You would raise her." "I have raised horses and worked land. I can raise a little girl." Adeline studied him, his steadiness, his quiet strength. Her chest ached in a different way now. 2 days passed. Boone and Adeline never spoke of Buckhorn Ridge again. Instead, they mended clothes for Amira, chopped wood together, and shared meals under lamplight. Each night, Boone gave up his bed. Each morning, Adeline found herself glancing at him longer. The third night, she stepped outside and found Boone on the porch, watching the stars. She stood beside him, hands tucked into her sleeves. "You still want to take me to Buckhorn Ridge?" His eyes met hers. "No," she felt her breath catch. "Why not?" "Because I want you to stay, not because you were sent here by mistake, but because maybe you were meant to come here all along." Adeline's eyes shimmered. "I was scared when I got here, but now I am not." Boone took her hand gently. "You do not have to marry a stranger. You already know me." "I think I do," she said, voice thick with something she could no longer hide. "And I think I want to stay." Boone smiled, soft and certain. "Then stay." She looked up at him, her heart beating steady for the first time in years. "I will." The first morning after she chose to stay, Adeline rose before the sun and found the barn already open. Boone stood at the far end, brushing down the sorrel gelding whose left ear twitched at every stroke. She didn't speak at first, only watched from the open doorway, arms crossed against the chill. The light inside was soft, dusky gold, catching the dust in the air like fine powder. "I can learn that," she said. Boone looked over his shoulder. "You don't have to. I want to." She stepped inside without waiting for invitation. "I didn't grow up with horses, but I'm not afraid of them." He nodded once and handed her the brush. "He's nervous if you come at him too fast." "Ears tell you everything." She reached for the gelding slow, let him sniff her knuckles, then drew the brush down his shoulder. Boone didn't correct her, just watched. "I used to sew shirts in a shop with no windows," she said, not lifting her eyes from the horse. "They paid us by the piece. My fingers would bleed some days, but I didn't mind. I liked the quiet of it." Boone leaned against the stall rail. "You're not afraid of quiet?" "No," she said. "Not when it has room in it." The horse huffed and shifted his weight, but didn't move away. Boone crossed to the next stall, began tossing hay into the trough. "I've got a milk cow due in a few weeks," he said. "Her last calf didn't live. I'll need to keep an eye on her this time." Adeline set the brush down. "I'll sit with her if you need rest." He looked over at her, not surprised. "You sure?" "I wouldn't offer if I wasn't." Boone gave a brief nod, then turned back to the feed. Later that morning, Adeline sat on the porch steps with Amira in her lap, snipping apple slices with a penknife. The girl's hands were still thin, but her cheeks had begun to pink up again. She pointed at the trees beyond the pasture. "What's that?" "Ponderosa pine," Adeline answered. "Smells like vanilla when the sun hits it just right." Amira leaned back into her. "Can we go there?" Adeline smiled. "Not today, but maybe soon when the snow's melted." "Will Mr. Boone come too? I imagine he would. Boone stepped out with his coat across one shoulder. I'd come if asked. Amira grinned and chewed her apple slice. Adeline didn't say anything, but her eyes followed Boone as he walked toward the shed, his gait steady and unhurried. That evening they ate by lamplight again. Boone had caught a rabbit earlier, and Adeline had stewed it with onions and wild sage she'd found along the edge of the fence line. Amira fell asleep with her cheek pressed against the table before the bowls had cooled. "I can carry her," Boone said, standing. "She's heavier than she looks," Adeline warned, but he scooped the girl into his arms easily, careful not to wake her. Adeline followed to the small room where Amira now slept, folding back the quilt. Boone laid her down with a gentleness that took the breath from Adeline's chest. When they returned to the main room, Boone poured water into the wash basin. "I've got work up near the ridge tomorrow. Fence broke again." Adeline reached for a cloth. "I can take care of things here." "You sure?" "I said I was staying," she said, dipping the cloth into the basin. "That means I help." He didn't argue. He only stepped aside so she could wash the dishes. The fire had burned low by the time Boone settled onto the floor again. Adeline stood at the hearth, watching the embers pulse. "You don't have to sleep there," she said. He looked up. "It's fine. There's room in the bed we don't have to touch." Boone didn't answer right away. When he did, it was quiet. "Not because I don't want to. I just didn't want to presume." "I know," she said. Then after a pause, "But I trust you." He stood slowly, not making a sound on the floorboards. She didn't move as he passed her, only followed after she heard him pull back the quilt. They laid side by side, space between them, the silence not stiff but easy. She faced the window, he faced the ceiling. "Did you ever think about marrying again?" she asked. "No," he said. "Not until you walked up my path." She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Her hand found his beneath the quilt, her fingers curling into his. He didn't pull away. Outside, wind stirred through the trees, but inside, everything held still. The days shortened fast as October deepened. Mornings began with frost silvering the grass, and the mountains wore their first thin shawl of snow. Adeline spent them in the kitchen or with Amira, who had begun trailing her like a shadow, never clingy, just nearby, as though her small body had finally decided it could rest. Boone came home that afternoon with a split lip and dirt on his collar. Adeline looked up from the mending in her lap when the door opened. "What happened?" "Bay mare stepped wrong on the ridge," he said, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Went down hard. I caught a branch on the way." She stood across the room. "Sit." He didn't argue, only lowered himself into the chair by the hearth while she fetched a damp cloth. She knelt, dabbing at the blood. His skin was warm beneath the smudge of pine tar on his cheek. "I could clean the wound better if you held still." "I'm still, not enough." He chuckled under his breath, then winced. "You're lucky it's not worse," she said. "Luck's never been something I counted on." She didn't reply, just pressed the cloth against his brow, her hand steady. The moment stretched between them close enough to see the fine lines at the edges of his eyes, the way his lashes caught the firelight. The next morning, he was gone before sunrise. Adeline woke to the smell of burnt cedar and Amira tugging her sleeve. "He said to tell you he'd be back before supper," the girl said, her voice husky with sleep. "He took the bay mare again." Adeline dressed them both and spent the morning teaching Amira how to fold dough for hand pies. The girl fumbled at first, but her fingers were nimble and quick to mimic. By noon, flour dusted their aprons and the cabin smelled of butter and spiced apples. Later, after the firewood was stacked and the garden bed cleared for the season, Adeline found Boone's ledger in the drawer beneath the shelf. She studied the columns of numbers, neat and precise. Enough hay to get through winter. 2 cows due before spring. One wagon axle needing repair. She read it all, then carefully closed the book and returned it to its place. He came back just before dark, his coat damp and his boots caked with clay. Adeline met him at the door with a towel. Fence holding this time, better than before, might last the snow. She stepped aside to let him shed his coat. You ever think about hiring help? I've thought on it, he said, wiping his hands. But the last man I took on left after 3 weeks. Said the quiet got to him. Not everyone's built for quiet, I know. She moved to the stove where supper waited. You've got a good place here, Boone. It could grow. He didn't sit. You think it should? I think it already is. He looked at her then, not with hesitation, but with something more settled. You like this life. There's honesty in it, she said, and room to breathe. Amira came in just then, dragging a quilt behind her. Boone reached down without a word and lifted her into his arms. She wanted to wait up, Adeline said. He carried her to the bed, her head already drooping against his shoulder. I'll tuck her in. Adeline watched him go, her hands still wrapped in the dishcloth. When he returned, he leaned against the doorframe of the kitchen. I've been thinking. About what? You didn't come here looking for me. She folded the cloth slowly. No, but you stayed. She turned. Yes, he stepped forward. You didn't promise yourself to anyone yet. No. I know I'm not polished. I don't say things easy. I don't need polished, she said, and I don't want easy. He didn't reach for her right away. He waited, hands at his sides. If I asked you to make a life with me here, would you? She crossed the space between them. You don't have to ask. I do, he said, because I mean it. She reached for his hand. Then yes, I'd marry you. The fire cracked behind them, but neither turned. Boone's fingers closed around hers, firm and certain. I'll ride to the parson on Sunday, he said. All right. He didn't kiss her then. He only brought her hand to his chest and held it there, against the steady thrum of a heart that had waited longer than it cared to admit. And Adeline, who had once crossed a continent for a stranger, knew she had finally come home. Boone shaved that Sunday morning for the first time in months. He used the old straight razor his father had passed down, the one with the bone handle and faded initials carved into it. Adeline didn't hover, but she lingered close enough to catch the scent of lye soap and pine resin as he tightened his suspenders and buttoned his cleanest shirt. Light filtered through the cabin window, pale and unhurried, brushing the wood floor in soft shapes. Amira stood by the door with her boots on the wrong feet, a ribbon tied crooked in her hair. Do people wear gloves to get married? Boone crouched and fixed her laces. Only if it's cold enough. Adeline stepped into view, her shawl wrapped snug across her shoulders. Which it is. They rode with the wagon hitched, and the road still half frozen. The parson lived in Willow Gap, some 7 miles south, where the houses sat closer and the river ran shallow and clear. Boone kept one hand steady on the reins, the other near the brake as they descended the ridge. Adeline sat beside him, her posture calm, but her fingers knotted in her lap. You don't have to be nervous, he said. I'm not. He glanced at her hands. I'm cold, she added. He didn't push it. The road required both eyes with the way the ruts twisted around the rocks. The parson's house was modest, with a lean-to stable out back and a stovepipe chimney that curled smoke into the gray sky. His wife opened the door, a woman with silver streaks in her braid, and a voice that reminded Adeline of the river in thaw, low, steady, and certain. She showed them into the front room, where a Bible sat open and a quilt hung as curtain against the draft. Boone didn't fidget, but he did shift his stance once, just slightly, as the parson read the vows. Adeline spoke her part without wavering. She kept her eyes on Boone's the whole time, and when the parson said the words that made it done, she felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight for years. They ate bread and apple jam with the parson and his wife afterward, and Amira fell asleep against Boone's side with her mouth stained sweet. When they left, the woman pressed a jar of preserves into Adeline's hands. "For the hard days," she said, "because there'll be some. But you look like a woman who's not afraid of work." Adeline met her eyes. "Neither is he." They rode back in the hush of late afternoon. No one said much. Amira slept again, curled in the blanket across the backboard, her breath fogging the cold air. Boone reached once, midway through the last mile, and laced his fingers through Adeline's. She didn't speak, just held tight. That night, Boone didn't sleep on the floor. He didn't ask either. He simply stood at the foot of the bed as she folded back the quilt and waited until she nodded. "You sure?" "Yes." He lit the lamp low and left it burning. They undressed without ceremony, careful not to wake the child in the next room. Boone's hands were steady even when the lamplight caught the scar near his collarbone, the one she hadn't noticed before. "Gunshot?" she asked. "Splintered beam." "Year the roof caved in." She traced the edge of it, then let her hand rest flat against his chest. When they lay down, they stayed close. Quiet. Not rushed. Boone's breath was slow against her neck, and his arms circled her back as if afraid she'd vanish come morning. "I never thought I'd marry again," he said. "I never thought I'd marry at all." He kissed her shoulder once, then settled into the crook of her body like he'd done it for years. By dawn, snow fell soft and silent. Boone rose first, built the fire, and went to feed the stock. When Adeline came out wrapped in a blanket, he handed her a mug of coffee without a word. Amira still slept, one heel poking out from beneath the quilt. Adeline leaned against the doorframe, looking out over the pasture. "I could plant winter onions," she said, "and put in kale." "I saw some seed left near the loft," Boone nodded. "We'll need a better root cellar. I can draw the plans." He sipped his coffee. "I'll dig." They stood there a while longer, the sound of snow ticking against the roof, the land around them quiet and wide and waiting. Boone reached over, gently pulled the blanket tighter around her. "You warm enough?" She looked up at him, her eyes full of something unspoken and whole. "I am now." The thaw came late that year, with March dragging its heels across the high ridges. The snow receded in patches, revealing earth dark and waiting. Boone repaired the northern fence line with gloved hands, the post-hole digger biting into frost-stiff dirt, while Adeline began coaxing life back into the garden rows with a hand rake and quiet focus. Amira trailed between them, her boots muddy and her eyes bright with the first warmth of sun on her face. Boone glanced over the field. "You reckon the soil's still good?" Adeline pressed her fingers into the softened earth. "It's held more than one season. There's worms moving just under." "Feels alive." He nodded and leaned on the rail. "Never heard it put that way." She looked up. "You hear plenty, you just don't say it out loud." He didn't argue. She smiled and stood, brushing her hands clean on her apron. They worked until the light shifted gold and long, then washed up in the basin near the stove, trading places without needing to speak. Boone dried his arms on a flour sack towel while Adeline braided Amira's hair into two neat plaits. "You ever think on teaching her to read?" Boone asked. "I already started," Adeline said, tying off the last ribbon. "She memorized most of the letters last week." Boone crouched in front of Amira. "Can you find your name?" The girl pointed to the worn slate leaning against the wall where a shakia had been drawn in chalk. "There." He looked to Adeline. "She's quick. She watches everything, just like you." That night, after Amira was tucked into her cot with her rag doll and a warm stone wrapped in flannel, Adeline pulled a folded paper from the drawer. Boone had just finished stacking the last of the kindling by the hearth. "This came by courier," she said, offering it. "Postmaster from Buckhorn Ridge. Letter was delayed in a winter hold. It's from Thomas Granger." Boone took the paper but didn't open it. "You read it." "I did." He waited. He married a widow in town 2 weeks after I was supposed to arrive. Said he hoped I found peace somewhere else. Boone set the letter beside the lamp and turned to her. You have. Adeline met his gaze. I know. He crossed the room slowly, then reached for her waist. I was thinking about the orchard patch beyond the creek. If we cleared the brush, we might get apples in a few years. She rested her hand over his. I'd like that. Maybe a plum tree too. He leaned closer. We'll plant it together. They stood like that until the fire burned low, neither needing to say more. By late spring, the cabin looked different, not bigger, but fuller. Boone had built a lean-to for the feed barrels, and Adeline painted the porch rail in soft strokes of leftover whitewash. Amira's books sat stacked beside the hearth, a pine shelf Boone had carved when the weather kept them in for 3 straight days. That evening, Boone came in from the shed with sawdust on his sleeves and something in his hand. Found this in the barn loft. It was a tin box, rusted at the corners. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a pair of silver hair combs. Were they hers? Adeline asked softly. Boone nodded. My mother's. Adeline turned one over in her palm. They're beautiful. I think she'd want you to have them. Adeline looked to him, her voice quiet. Are you sure? I'm certain. She slid one into her hair, then the other, her fingers trembling a little. Boone watched her, his expression unreadable but warm. He stepped closer and took her hand. You belong here, not because you stayed. Because you made it yours. She kissed him then, not in haste, but with all the steadiness they'd built between them. When they pulled apart, Boone rested his forehead against hers. There's nothing missing anymore, he said. No, she agreed. Not a thing. That summer, they harvested more than they expected: radishes, beans, and rows of kale so thick Adeline had to blanch and dry them for storage. The cow calved without trouble, and Boone let Amira name the calf Juniper. On Sundays, they walked down to the river bend, where Boone taught Amira how to skip stones while Adeline sat on a quilt with her sewing and listened to the water. They spoke less and laughed more. Nights passed with the sound of crickets outside and the soft creak of the cabin settling deeper into its frame. By autumn, a second room had been added to the house. Boone built it with his own hands, and Adeline filled it with books, her mending basket, and a cradle they sanded smooth together in the evenings. The first frost came early that year. Adeline woke to find Boone already up, feeding the stove. She stepped into the kitchen, her belly rounded beneath her nightgown, and leaned into him. He kissed the top of her head. Fire's holding. She nodded against his chest. So are we. Outside, smoke curled into the morning sky and the trees turned gold. The land was quiet but not empty. Everything had found its place. They had too, together, forever.